Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Welcome back for day 2. We are talking about literature today. I was thinking about you last evening, about the fact that you were so patient to sit through 3 lectures on kind of theoretical methodology. And I'm going to use a Friends reference now. I don't know if you know about the sitcom Friends. It was a big deal in the States. I saw every episode like 7 times over the last 10 years. But there's this famous episode where Phoebe, a guitar player, teaches her friend Joey how to play guitar. But have you seen this episode? But for so long, she's like, you cannot play the strings, just do the finger movements. And he's like, I want to play guitar. And I felt like that was what yesterday was like for all of us. We learned like the finger movements, we learned like the foundations, we talked a lot about theory. But now we can play. We have literature on the table, right? We'll have a film analysis this afternoon. So we're going to be applying these ideas that we picked up yesterday to literary, film, cultural artifacts. So welcome back. Okay, are you ready to begin? Yes, we'll do about 45 minutes and then look at passages, answer a few questions, and then we'll have a break. So this lecture, Hurricane Katrina and the Traumatic Effects of Gentrification, may be a little bit ambitious in the sense that it returns to some foundational quotes from trauma theory and narrative medicine from yesterday's lectures and applies them to literary works that worry about climate displacement on the one hand and communities of the unhoused on the other hand. So we will be talking about both climate change and about a housing crisis, which to my mind are closely linked. As we'll see from contemporary works about the effects of climate change, there is a parallel worry about housing loss. And as we see from contemporary works about housing loss and the unhoused, there is a parallel worry that there is no shelter for folks who need to find shelter during a weather event or even a pandemic, which is a topic for another day. I don't know if you had this like saying here in India, but during the pandemic, people were saying, stay home. And the worry was there were so many people who did not have a home to stay at, that brought up a lot of other kind of important conversations. We will begin with the language of trauma and the growing climate change crisis. In an opinion piece for the New York Times, Esau McCaulley argued that, here's our first quote, in 2023, nature called on us all to be quiet and listen. Given unprecedented flooding, devastating wildfires, record temperatures, and dangerous storms, McCaulley continues, just as the oppressed are finding their voice, the effects of climate change have grown louder over the past few decades, but in 2023, it felt like a shout. I want to propose that literature uniquely listens to nature when maybe governmental agencies and huge polluting corporations fail. Literature bears witness to climate change in a way that insists, like McCaulley, humans wake up. Of the past 2 years, McCaulley continues, quote, the impact was everywhere. The eastern part of the country, this is the U.S. he's referring to, experienced unprecedented flooding. In Hawaii and the Northwest, fires did untold damage. In the Midwest, smoke hung over towns and cities. In the Southwest, places like Phoenix and Texas endured record-breaking stretches of heat. In Florida, the water temperatures rose so high that it was unsafe to swim. Storms became increasingly dangerous. How great was the temptation to keep chattering, to debate messaging, to wonder what degree of alarm was most appropriate to sound. This is the language of trauma studies and narrative medicine from yesterday, the 2 models of viewing the world that insist we listen to the suffering of others. What does it mean to think of the climate, our earth, as suffering? And the signs of the suffering, like flooding, the fires, the heat and the melting glaciers as testimony of things gone awry. Many people think about trauma studies as taking up the problem of describing a single event that came too soon in order to be processed by a witness. We talked about that yesterday. Maybe the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki come to mind, or when the planes hit the World Trade Center towers, or the Challenger explosion from the 1980s. That's my kind of foundational trauma. Or gun violence at any given school in the United States at any time. Depending on how old we are, we each remember where we were at the time of the unexpected traumatic event, but we may feel we do not have language to depict it. And as we discussed yesterday, there is another aspect of trauma studies that understands trauma in the terms of failed witness. In the case of the AIDS crisis of the 80s, or as I argue in my next book, homelessness across the US in most major cities. But in those cases, we very much could see what is happening. These tragedies were long in coming and have existed before our eyes every single day. And the same, I would argue, is true of the climate crisis. And we'll remember from yesterday that when interviewing survivors of the AIDS crisis, Carruth recasts a prior definition of trauma, one originally theorized as an event missed because it happens too fast, in these terms. So part of the traumatic experience itself is the relation to other people, others who are actively aggressive or simply don't want to listen. Narrative medicine and trauma theory are two modes that I think can also help us understand a literary approach to climate change, as they insist on acknowledging the humanity of those who suffer, which is one way to say that they both deeply are invested in the idea of an ethical relation that takes the form of listening. And so if we bring Esau McCaulley's argument into the picture, we can think about how he is using that language, the language of listening, in terms of the climate, in terms of the planet. He wants us to listen to what the planet is telling us regarding climate change. So when Sharon reminds us that Kathy Carruth observes the shock of traumatic sight reveals at the heart of human subjectivity what can be defined as an ethical relation, she is discussing what it means to engage with an other, even when that other is communicating something difficult, aggressive, alienating, estranging, terrifying, terrible. This is precisely McCaulley's point when he asks why we refuse to listen to the terrible and strange effects of climate change on the environment. The earth seems to be screaming at us, but no one who can do anything about it is acting or even seems to be flinching. Narrative medicine also thinks about treating suffering in terms of listening to the story, the narrative of someone in pain. What if we took this approach to the climate too, provided an empathic ear or eye for the suffering earth? Again, this is what literature can do, and I promise you we'd get to the literature today. It can testify as well on the environment's behalf. Not only does it personify the environment so we can face it like we would face an other, but also it has an affective dimension, one that makes us feel emotion and perhaps compels us to insist upon treatment or change. Such texts as Rachel Carson's Silent Spring from way back as early as 1962, written over half a century ago, sounded the alarm. As McCaulley points out, we have now arrived at the point where the springs are no longer silent. Other literary works, such as Jesmyn Ward's Salvage the Bones, Ben Lerner's 1004, Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora, Annie Proulx's Berkshires, Barbara Kingsolver's The Flight Behavior, Jenny Offill's Weather, Rumen Alam's Leave the World Behind, all seem to ask, following the great work of Amitav Ghosh in The Great Derangement, climate change and the unthinkable, how long can we continue to ignore the climate crisis before us? So I list all of those texts because it seems like there is a genre emerging. I would call it cli-fi, climate fiction. All at once, it seems, these novels are coming up to make us ask questions about the effects of climate change. But it started back in 1962, I would argue, with Rachel Carson. She wrote about a town in the heart of America that seemed to be in harmony with its surroundings. And then one spring, something changed. It was a spring without voices. In the mornings, which had once throbbed with the dawn chorus of robins, catbirds, doves, jays, and wrens, and scores of other bird voices, there was now no sound. Only silence lay over the fields and woods and marshes. On the farms, the hens brooded, but no chicks hatched. What would we do without the sound of birds? I recorded this morning from the place where I was staying the sights and the sounds of the beautiful landscape around campus, birds singing, right? It's lovely. So Silent Spring asks us to think about what happens when those sounds go away. And what McCaulley seemed to be suggesting at the beginning of this year and last is that sometime in the not-so-distant future, we will not have the Earth testifying to climate disaster in terms of its loudness, drumming rains and cracking fires, but in terms of its silence. And at that point, it will be likely too late. Imagine being in a class with 35 of my students who spend 15 weeks talking about climate fiction. I think we left all kind of despondent. But as we will see, there is a hopeful, a futuristic message as well. So by taking up the language of climate change on the one hand and the language of trauma studies on the other, I want to connect here the environmental displacement of people with the traumatic effects of gentrification. When an entire community gets wiped out, as in the example of Ward 4 in New Orleans for the Mississippi Gulf Coast with regard to Hurricane Katrina, the victims are doubly displaced. First, they must leave their homes due to damaging and life-threatening winds, rains, and/or fires, and then because their neighborhoods are bought up cheaply and rebuilt, they become unaffordable to the original families. We might think of rebuilding as a good thing, but too often, at least in the United States, rebuilding leads to higher prices that leads to pricing out poorer communities. And I think that the most recent housing crisis in the U.S. is very powerful because of the American dream narrative. The promise that working hard will allow one to earn enough money to buy a home and have a car in the driveway and maybe 2 children in a garden. That is simply not the case anymore, at least in large American cities. So the housing crisis and the climate crisis feel as if they are somehow inextricable, leaving the new generation of young people feeling as though they have been let down by the generation that came before. So again, in our tutorials, I love to talk more with you about this, but I can tell you that in the United States, people your age are very angry. They are angry that the generations before them haven't dealt with the effects of climate change, and they are angry that they feel like they have no opportunity after they graduate college to get a job, to buy a house, and they've spent their whole lives reading about the American dream. Work hard, get a job, buy a home, have a family. And that is nearly impossible for so many young people living in the States right now. So that is what's kind of motivating this argument today. As Benjamin Applebaum has recently argued, the rise of homelessness is often portrayed as a collection of personal tragedies, the result of bad choices or bad luck. But the first law of real estate applies to homelessness too. Location, location, location. The nation's homeless population is concentrated in New York, the cities of coastal California, and a few other islands of prosperity. Well-educated, well-paid professionals have flocked to those places, driving up housing prices. What happens when upper middle class people in the U.S. can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on property? It means the prices go up in a supply and demand market, and that means that people without that same level of privilege cannot buy property anymore. Crucially, those cities and their suburbs have made it virtually impossible to build enough housing to keep up. For Applebaum, in other words, homelessness is not simply the result of individual bad luck or even bad decisions. As with so many injustices in the United States, and I will just speak from that context for this lecture, especially since the summer of 2020, we can see ways in which housing trauma is the result of systemic disenfranchisement born out of a commitment to white supremacy and capitalism. So again, when I say the word trauma here, I do not mean it in the sense of an event that happened too soon for the victims to be able to prepare. Often that is the primary definition scholars associate with the American Psychiatric Association's definition of PTSD, an event. Again, Carruth started her career arguing that the definition of post-traumatic stress generally is defined as a response, sometimes delayed, to an overwhelming event or events. But this is something different. This is an ongoing systemic crisis. What if we applied the idea of social trauma from yesterday instead, not simply to illness narratives, but also to climate change and housing insecurity? After all, housing insecurity is not always a sudden condition. For many, quote, part of the traumatic experience itself is the relation to other people. To use Carruth's words, others who are actively aggressive or simply don't want to listen. So when a discussion of a virus and housing insecurity come together, as it is in the COVID-19 moment, it's a time where once again the national government in the U.S. struggled to account for millions of virus deaths, as well as the eviction crisis we now face because of a related economic fallout. During the COVID crisis in the U.S., people could not go to work. They did not have paychecks. They could not pay their rent, so they were evicted as a result of that. And we tried to account for that by putting in place protections, but for some people, it was not enough. So for us, we had a COVID crisis, and we had a housing crisis, and over here, all behind us, we had a climate crisis. And so we're kind of like all coming out of that right now. According to the New York Times editorial board special edition of the Sunday Review, dated May of 2020, just months into the pandemic, well before the coronavirus pandemic posed its own threats to the life of American cities, they were struggling. Over the last half-century, their infrastructure of opportunity has badly decayed. Their public schools no longer prepare students to succeed. Their subways are reliably unreliable. Their water runs with lead. Where political and journalistic discourse perhaps falls short in showing the distinctions, literature steps in. As I propose here, the literary language of some of our most compelling American texts function to defamiliarize the problem and shock us into action. At stake, then, is an ethical dimension to this literary work. It gives a face to the faceless in our everyday lives and demands that we reassess our treatment of and our attitudes toward suffering in the American city. I'm going to pivot here now to kind of talk about this idea of the materiality of care, which is the idea that you can show you care for somebody or for your population by giving them the material things they need to survive. And so I was preparing these ideas for spring of 2019 for a workshop on trauma and the materiality of care at Georgetown University. And I was struck by that phrase. What does it mean to show care via material things? And I presented this work at Georgetown University. I have a perfect case of an unhoused person who comes up to a character in a Tony Kushner play and basically says, pay attention. And at the same time, during that conference, I walked out with my friends in Georgetown, and there were unhoused people lining the streets asking for help. And I thought, now I'm in a tricky position, right? I have just said we have to pay attention to these literary voices. And what do you do when you are confronted with a face walking down the street of, say, Georgetown? So here is the example that I presented on. I returned to Kushner's Angels in America. It's a two-part play that demands a witness to the HIV/AIDS crisis. And I had originally read that in the context that we discussed yesterday. What does it mean to be called upon to pay attention to people who are suffering with HIV/AIDS? And then I reread that book, and I noticed all of the references to housing displacement, to the unhoused. And so I'm looking here at a jarring scene featuring Hannah, the Mormon mother of Joe Pitt, and the homeless woman she encounters in the Bronx. In Act 3, Scene 4 of the first play, Millennium Approaches, a desperate and also slightly clueless Hannah, this is the Mormon mother, making her way from the West Coast to the Bronx in New York to see after her son, ends up on an abandoned lot in the South Bronx and approaches a homeless woman, an alien figure herself demanding a witness, voicing back to Hannah all of the terrible things people have hurled at her in passing. I don't know if I can read this. I always ask my students to do the voices when they're reading characters. Slurp, slurp, slurp. You will stop that disgusting slurping. You disgusting slurping, feeding animal. Feeding yourself, just feeling yourself. What would it matter to you or anyone if you just stopped feeding and died? If we read this diatribe as a projection of everything witnessed by the homeless woman, we can see the ways that she has been dehumanized, but in a very particular way, through the way that she eats, through her mode of sustenance. She speaks the unconscious minds of the people who walk by her every day, wishing her dead instead of as a witness to poverty in America. The only lucid moment that occurs in this scene is when the woman gives Hannah the exact location and directions for the place she is looking for. She is a helper. And her closing line is, quote, "In the new century, I think we will all be insane." How can it be, we might ask, that in some places, such as New Orleans, New York, San Francisco, Miami Beach, the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C., places thriving with cash and resources and clear evidence, material care, right, of American prosperity, there remains a significant homeless population that we look at in the face every day? Douglas Crimp would call this social trauma, as it is trauma born not out of an event that happened too soon, as a traditional way to understand trauma theory, but out of several events, millions of microaggressions, predictable events, when people would rather turn away than engage in the problem of poverty on the street. Tomorrow we'll talk about Ghanaian-American author Yaa Gyasi's representation of housing trauma. And we will talk tomorrow about how, unlike other authors, she seems deeply committed to revealing injustices in the wake of Hurricane Katrina and other natural disasters. These authors call into question the very notion of trauma itself, much like Laura S. Brown's groundbreaking theoretical work, Not Outside the Range. So here I want to say, like, if we reread these books, both about climate crisis and about housing crisis, we can once again start to shift our definition of what trauma could or should be defined as. And that's something Laura S. Brown does remarkably well. She's a feminist legal scholar, and she wrote this important essay called Not Outside the Range. It's a feminist reconsideration of trauma that emphasizes the ways in which we are all implicated in trauma. By now, in the wake of weather events and considering domestic abuse, Brown's focus as a lawyer, an experience very much within the range of humans around the globe. In her essay, Brown describes the difficulty of defending clients who testify in repeated domestic abuse in court of law because prior DSM definitions of PTSD were too limiting. Whereas the DSM-4, remember, finally it gets its definition in 1980, defines a traumatic event as outside the range of human experience. Brown calls for a more inclusive definition that adequately describes, quote, the effects of exposure to repetitive interpersonal violence and victimization, a definition now broadened and reflected in the most recent DSM volume. So she did get her definition revised. Brown asks, what if a traumatic event is very much within the range of human experience and can, in fact, be reliably predicted? So the original definition, a traumatic event is an event that occurs outside the range of human experience, something that humans are not expected to or equipped to confront. And Laura S. Brown is saying, what if we think about climate disaster? What if we think about domestic abuse? What if we think about sexual abuse? What if we think about being unhoused? These are very much within the human experience. So we needed a broader definition. The important feminist question has implications for such geographic areas as well as the Mississippi Gulf Coast and New Orleans, disenfranchised communities repeatedly devastated by natural disasters. Even though these disasters are recurrent and very much part of citizens' experiences, the national government, again the U.S., repeatedly turns a blind eye to both causes and effects of such routine economic, cultural, and climate-related devastation. In Beyond Katrina, a meditation on the Mississippi Gulf Coast from 2010, Natasha Trethewey showcases this tendency as she interlaces the story of her brother's personal struggles with the law and the dual weather events of Hurricane Camille and Hurricane Katrina. This is like a double trauma, right? We can think about it in terms of Freud's deferred action. In the 1960s, Hurricane Katrina ravaged New Orleans and the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And then in 2005, Hurricane Katrina came through and wiped out the community once again. And so you have a lot of fiction testifying and memoirs testifying to this. So I'm going to hone down now to think about Hurricane Katrina as a specific weather event for the rest of this lecture. And then next lecture, we'll talk about the Boxing Day tsunami of 2004. So such literary works as Beyond Katrina, Sarah Broom's The Yellow House, Chris Rose's One Dead in the Attic, and Jerry Ward's The Katrina Papers, A Journal of Trauma and Recovery, suggest that such natural disasters as Hurricane Katrina have a traumatic effect on an entire community that survived an event very much within the range of human experience, given the effects of global warming and our current eco-crisis. As Trethewey and Brown suggest, we have a civic duty to bear witness to such events that leave people without homes, communities, libraries, newspapers, jobs. This demand is neither a simply literary nor ethical. It is legal and political in its dual potential to defend the disenfranchised and help rebuild an entire community, about which leaders once said, this is what some leaders said in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, let it go. let New Orleans wash into the sea, which is a way of saying, let's just forget about this community, this town, this geography, we'll rebuild. For me, this is a failure of witness, right? So you have civic leaders saying things like, just let it go, wash into the sea. And then you have community members like Sarah Broom saying, I was born and raised here. We cannot wash out this entire community, build and rebuild. So now, Sarah Broom. Her 2019 memoir is an exemplary case in this continuing conversation about housing trauma in the wake of climate disaster, the disaster named Hurricane Katrina. This might be before your time, 2005. I'm dating myself now. I remember having a young child. I was in my 30s. I was scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, kind of learning about this devastating hurricane. If you watch like news accounts, you see the spirals, like you know that it is going to hit a highly populated area. And this area was very much populated by kind of disenfranchised and marginalized people. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? How can you prepare? The Yellow House situates Brown's own coming of age in the context of her childhood in New Orleans, Louisiana, and traces the ways institutionalized racism on a national level affects the most vulnerable among us. Although wildly acclaimed for its discussion of the effects of Hurricane Katrina, the memoir is about much more than Katrina. It is about systematic problems that have plagued New Orleans and cities like New Orleans well before Katrina hit, extending right up to this very day. New Orleans in the U.S. is where upper middle class ladies go to have their parties before they get married. It's where college students from wealthy backgrounds go to have spring break. And Sarah Broom is saying all of this money is coming in from tourists to Bourbon Street. And at the same time, there's this Ward 4 on the outskirts that is not benefiting from that influx of money, and in fact does not have the infrastructure to be protected against such things as hurricanes. So a close reading of Broom's description in this work of a bridge called the High Rise, connected to the deadly Chef Menteur Highway, I argue that Broom's work, while a highly personalized count of growing up in New Orleans, is also implicitly political in its discussion of poor planning, gentrification, and building decisions that negatively affect the people of New Orleans East. Reading the work in this way, we can see not only how it participates in a traditional of acclaimed memoirs, but also how it participates in a larger conversation about gentrification and city planning at the forefront of our minds in the 21st century. Broom introduces the ominous threat of Chef Menteur Highway as early as the third page of her memoir, confessing that, quote, even as I write this, I am troubled again by what it meant for us, me and my 11 siblings, to have to cross Chef Menteur Highway, which was then and is now a sea of prostitution with cars pulling over, sometimes partway onto the sidewalk, creeping alongside you even if you were only a child on an errand. This is the dangerous place where a car dragged Broom's sister Karen and struck and killed Broom's best friend Alvin. The vulnerability Broom feels even when recalling this scene is palpable, using such words as troubled and creeping. Broom gives us insight into the feeling of being approached by a strange person in a car, as a child or on an errand, by men in cars who were there, quote, making deals involving drugs and prostitution. And so while we think of this as only a passing detail in Broom's book about New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina, the highway and the bridge connected with it come back repeatedly like a leitmotif, reminding us about how this one location is a perfect example for other ways the city has betrayed her. For me, the most powerful moment occurs in Perdido, a chapter which translates loosely as lost or missing. So many things are lost or missing in this section. Broom herself, who now decides she must make her way home from Burundi, but also the people of New Orleans radically displaced in the wake of a hurricane. Interestingly, this chapter is more about Broom's work for the how she has worked for the unpopular and ultimately ineffective Mayor Nagin. In this way, it details how the homeless, drug addicts, sex workers, and people of New Orleans East were so dramatically displaced before and after the hurricane. Here she discusses the effects of gentrification in her new neighborhood of Carrollton Avenue in Holly Grove, as well as the fact that, quote, the city's homeless population had doubled from 6,000 pre-water to 12,000 post. Pre-water is pre-Katrina, a homeless population of 6,000 people in 2005. After that hurricane, 12,000 homeless people. It is with this recognition, the single unfathomable statistic, that Broom returns to the, quote, interstate bridge on Claiborne Avenue. It is as though this troubling image has been on her mind dating back to the writing of the book. Whereas Brown disdains the architectural detail for the ways in which it ripped through a thriving black community, the mayor in 2008 complained publicly that the homeless population camped there, quote, the city under the bridge, and was not good for tourism. We have this conversation in the States about bridge building, about interstates that go through communities. My community is one. I live in New Britain, Connecticut, which is very kind of post-industrial. A lot of working people lived there. And when the state decided they needed to make it faster for people to commute from one end of the state to the other, they said, we are going to put Route 72 through your downtown. So a downtown thriving, again, it was a thriving black community. It had 4 theaters, it had barber shops, it had coffee shops. That was all taken down to put in a highway so wealthier people could go through faster. And meanwhile, the people in wealthier neighborhoods said, no, thank you. We are not taking your Highway 72. That is going to rip up our theaters and our coffee shops. And they were privileged enough and powerful enough with their tax-paying dollars to stop that. So now we have communities with highways going through, like Chef Mantier Highway in New Orleans, and we have communities without highways going through. And you could imagine what like the class and the racial composition is. So what I'm trying to say here is Broom is writing about Hurricane Katrina, but she's also writing about how this population had been affected in many ways before they were forgotten about in the wake of this weather event. So it is ordinarily we think of bridges as connecting one place to another or one group of people to another group of people. City planners love to think about bridges and the architecture of bridges. And it's so ironic then that this bridge in Broom's book represents the opposite. Destruction of a neighborhood and a demonization of a group of impoverished people and unheard protesters chanting, "Hey, Ray, what do you say? We need housing today." Ultimately then, Ray is the city planner leader. Ultimately then, what becomes a very personal point of departure in the opening pages of The Yellow House slowly gives way to a description of this bridge as a figure for trauma and dislocation in New Orleans and beyond. And even more globally still, it remains a powerful figure for trauma and dislocation in so many parts of the world where the disenfranchised are chanting and city leaders cannot hear their cries. And from there, I want to go on to another powerful representation of the effects of Hurricane Katrina, that Category 5 hurricane worsened by rising temperatures. And that book is Jesmyn Ward's Salvage the Bones from 2011. I've talked to some students in the room who have read Toni Morrison and who really appreciate her style. Jesmyn Ward has been called the next Toni Morrison in American literature, so I'm not sure if that means anything to you, but Salvage the Bones in 2011 represents the daily lives and struggles of a family living in the Mississippi Gulf Coast in the days leading leading up to and just after the landfall of Katrina. And so yesterday I said, when we kind of talk about traumatic repetition, we talked about it in terms of individual people having these repetitive thoughts. But what I'm trying to argue here is that you can see that a real trauma has been done with regard to the way Hurricane Katrina was covered and dealt with, because there are so many books about it. All of these literary authors are repeatedly telling the story of Hurricane Katrina, which suggests that we have to deal with it at the unconscious level, at least in the U.S. This novel is not a memoir. It's written in a lyrical and poetic style, which makes the curt and disjointed voices of the broadcast media that are represented within it all the more disorienting when they appear in the book. And so again, back to close reading, this novel is told from the point of view of Esh, a young girl who is pregnant. Hurricane Katrina is on the horizon. Her beloved pit bull is also pregnant. You're worried that the pit bull is going to be able to have her puppies, and also is Esh going to be able to have her babies? And it's so poetic, but there's this startling moment where newscasters come in, and it's all fuzzy and staticky, like you're trying to tune into a news report. And that's what I wanted to look at. The static and direct address of the newscasters in these pages speak for all of us when they hesitate to capture the horrific storm hurling through toward Esh and her family. In this moment, we learn as much about the limits of literary representation as we do about Hurricane Katrina and the family of Esh. The first time early reports come in occurs when Esh checks on her father, who is in bed recovering from a violent accident that severs 3 fingers from his hand. He is drinking beer and taking medicine for pain. When Esh enters his room, he instructs her to, quote, play with the antenna, suggesting that the reception is bad. They cannot get an adequate signal. And while this is literally true, the failed signal seems to work like a metaphor for so much of the family's communication, as well as their ability to receive communication when they are in the coastal town of Salvage, Mississippi. Through a series of intercepted news segments that seem to be delivered by newscasters named Mike and Rachel, Esh learns about the encroaching storm, but only through static. These moments in the novel are noteworthy for the way they look on the page. The repeated ellipses begin early when a newscaster says, Katrina has made landfall in Florida. Silence. Miles from Miami. It is difficult to know from the first statement whether the ellipses indicate the newscaster's own struggles to get the words out on the page and what Esh and her father hear as a result of the static. When information gets lost in the ellipses, we understand that it is the static preventing the two from getting accurate information. Early reports say that there are some dead. Does anyone, silence, static, idea of where? Projection of the storm? It's all cut up. It's all fragmented. You only get bits and pieces. The question is Mike's, the newscaster's, and he seems to be asking in what direction the storm is headed. This would be important information for Esh to learn, and the static overwrites any valuable insights Mike could provide on the TV news. In this way, it is like the static. The static is an important metaphor to capture Esh's experience generally. She's cut off from society, she's cut off from her mother, the only woman surrounded by men and generally isolated in Salvage. This extended exchange is filled with blunt questions, not the poetic voice we are used to in this book. Mike asks Rachel, what would you advise our listeners to? Silence, followed by, so what does this mean? I don't know, have you ever tried to get information on like this crisis? And it's like, it's coming in and out, it's like bits and pieces, it's like static. I'm reading that as a metaphor for the inability to communicate this important information and the effects of what is to come. Mike seems to be the voice of Esh and her father taking in this information. What can they do anyway? To make matters worse, Esh's father says, "I can't see, and you're still in the way," language that refers to his experiences as a father separate from Katrina. And the next time we hear from the outside world about this storm, it is from within Esh's father's truck, a woman coming through the radio more clearly this time. Hurricane Katrina is now a Category 3 hurricane. It is scheduled to make landfall in Borough Triumph, Louisiana, sometime Monday morning. When the radio was switched off, we all seemed cut off from the information, hanging on every word of this radio announcer as if our lives were threatened too. Such a stylistic method, I would argue, builds the tension, so we feel the strain of preparing for Katrina. The only problem is our information is incomplete, as it is for Esh, as for so many people struggling to prepare for and survive this hurricane, barreling their way. The inability to describe the meaning exactly and to put the words and the effects of such a weather event seem to indicate both a lack of preparation from a psychic point of view and lack of witness from an ethical point of view. And here's the hope. And I think it has to do with literature, and it has to do with writing. It has to do with the ways that a novel and our literary tradition can bear witness. And it comes from this idea from Herbert Zoff's Literature as Cultural Ecology, Sustainable Texts. And he defines cultural ecology as the process of, quote, looking at the interaction and living interrelationship between culture and nature without reducing one to the other. For Zoff, literature is the ultimate cultural form, and that it provides a site of critical self-reflection of modern civilization, as well as a source of creative cultural self-renewal. So I would like to say that all of these Hurricane Katrina novels, as one special case, are using culture as a way to ask the larger culture to self-reflect, to reflect on this climate crisis and to reflect on the corresponding homeless crisis. And the way that Salvage the Bones does this is by drawing on the figure of the Greek goddess Medea. Medea, the murderous mother. We have all kinds of mothers in this novel, and Hurricane Katrina is referenced as one. So there's another subset of books that look at Greek icons in this kind of conversation about cultural ecology. Jesmyn Ward's Medea in Salvage the Bones, Bruce Holzinger's Daphne in The Displacements, and C. Pam Zhang's Persephone in Land of Milk and Honey from 2023 reveal how climate change threatens the American dream through forced displacement, racial disparities, unemployment, violence against women, and all as exemplified by the destruction of Mother Earth. Sorry, there was a long time between passages to look at. I love this one. Iconic goddess figures in this climate fiction, and in this one in particular, fiction about Hurricane Katrina, express disbelief at the failed witness of institutions with the power to reduce or reverse effects of climate change. As Ward writes in Salvage the Bones, "I will tie the glass and stone with string, hang the shards above my bed, so that they will flash in the dark and tell the story of Katrina, the mother that swept into the Gulf and slaughtered. Her chariot was a storm so great and black the Greeks would say it harnessed the dragons. She was the murderous mother." Here, Ward exemplarily invokes the iconic goddess Medea as a murderous mother to reflect the murderous Katrina, whose winds and rain created shards of glass, shards of transcultural literature, that transcultural literature can turn into a prism and a story that bears witness to the devastation of Mother Earth, the only home we have. So following this discussion, I have more discussion. I have some questions for us to think about. The first is, what is at stake in arguing for an ethical witness to Mother Earth or to climate change? Yesterday we talked about ethical witnesses in terms of those who are suffering from psychic or physical illness. Esau McCaulley says we need an ethical witness for the voice of Mother Earth. What might a theory of materiality of care contribute to trauma studies? We might take that one off the board. I skipped like 2 paragraphs in my presentation about that, but I love the idea of thinking about care, especially in a trauma studies seminar, not only having to do with the care for the mentality, but also like the related just need for things like shelter. In what ways can literature affect climate change and housing policy? And then this is the one I'm pondering, kind of based on my experience, talking about the importance of seeing someone in need who is unhoused, and then my tendency to keep walking with my affluent friends in a downtown neighborhood in Georgetown. How might engaging displaced or unhoused people test the limits of the ethical witness? So I'm going to ask my hosts now. I don't know if we wanted to stay on schedule and end at 11 or spend some time discussing. Okay. Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to hear from you the way we've been doing some passages and questions. So we started a little bit late. We'll end a little bit late. Can we look at this paragraph? This is my favorite. This is the hope. This is the literature. This is where we can kind of think about what language has in a conversation about trauma. And again, like reading this in the context of displacement of a young family and also the effects of Hurricane Katrina that could have been minimized. And maybe I'll just say, sorry, I have a lot of opinions on this. I don't know if any of you follow NFL, but in New Orleans, there's this place called the Superdome, and that's where the NFL professional football players play. That is often where they host the Super Bowl. This is like the mecca for football fans. And so there were at some points during this displacement crisis for Hurricane Katrina where leaders were saying, look, you all have to leave your homes, but the good news is you can all go to the Superdome and live there for a few months. And people were saying, are you kidding me right now? It's one thing to be able to pay $200 to see Taylor Swift perform there, or $500 to see the Super Bowl at the Superdome, but to tell people that it's going to be an absolute thrill of their lifetimes to leave their devastated homes and live with thousands of other people in a stadium because the city cannot get organized just seems like the ultimate insult. So anyway, that is where all of this literature is coming from. Like this is, I don't know. I feel like this is a literary response. So tell me, I told you I was interested in the Medea figure. Her chariot was a storm, and the reference to the Greeks, and the murderous mother. That's Katrina. That's also Medea. What do you see in this passage? Words, tone, sounds, punctuation, point of view. Any ideas? Shards above my bed. Tell this story. Does anything stand out? Thank you. Chariot. Awesome. Okay, so that line, her chariot was a storm so great and black, the Greeks would say it was harnessed to dragons. Tell me about chariot. Oh, we don't have a, oh, the mic is coming.
Yeah, so basically her chariot is a unique description of the disastrous storm that is coming.
Yes.
It is kind of a literary description also, that it symbolizes that chariot means the devastation that is coming on.
Beautiful.
In the form of a storm and wind, like speed at 200 kilometer per hour probably.
Yeah.
So chariot is a literary image created to represent the storm.
I love it. Yeah, think about that. So the ancient Greeks give us that, the image of the chariot, right? The murderous mother riding in on the chariot. We have that from centuries ago. And here is Jesmyn Ward having her young protagonist think about Hurricane Katrina using that language. So I love that. I think an extension of your thinking is like where contemporary language would fail, like, from the static on the radio, there is no way to talk about the effects of Katrina. We need to go back to the ancient Greeks, to the story of Medea, to look at what that image of the chariot can do. The chariot is a storm so great and black, we could say, the Greeks would say it was harnessed to the dragons. And then you're like, yes, I understand the impact of that. So that's lovely. Other words, yes.
Ma'am, the murderous mother also showcases how the nature can be of such a devastating state,
Yes.
and it shows how much, negative effect it can bring if it is in anger or in that kind of zone.
Yes, I love it. So what does it mean to compare Mother Earth to the murderous mother Medea? Medea, we know, killed her children because she was so angry about how her husband had treated her, right? And so, again, like this comparison I think is really interesting. What does it mean to compare Mother Earth or nature or a hurricane to a murderous mother? We think about Mother Earth or mothers. What do you think about mothers? They're nurturing, they give life, they are protective. But the murderous mother, in the form of Mother Earth or the planet, in the form of Medea, like that is not that kind of mother, right? Katrina killed so many people. Medea killed her own children. And so, yeah, we could kind of think about that. Is Mother Earth communicating her anger? We can kind of think about the globe as personified. And then what would that kind of expression of anger be telling us? That's brilliant. Maybe one more? Yes, thank you.
The phrase murderous mother is an oxymoron because mothers usually give birth to their child,
Yes.
and in this case we have seen that the storm has been used as a destructive mother. So it reflects that how nature and the environment can be equally destructive as well as it is protective.
Yes.
So it's quite symbolic, I think.
That's great. A mother is not supposed to be murderous. I love that. Like oxymoron, I think, is such a good word. And the same thing with like our assumptions about the planet, right?
Yes,
like
yes,
it
ma'am.
holds us, takes care of us. There was something else that you said that I wanted
And
to
sir,
reflect.
and ma'am, when the house was also wiped out by the storm,
Yes.
and the destruction of the house is also an example, an instance of environmental degradation and climate crisis. So we have on one hand the housing crisis, and on the other we have this environmental degradation. So this is also quite. These are two important elements which runs through the narrative.
Yes, that's great. And that's the other thing that I wanted to say. Like, how bad did things have to get that we are talking about these things via oxymorons, right? Like, that shows, like, the level of, I don't know, like, confusion or chaos that perhaps we are in now.
Thank you.
There was another hand. Yes. Okay. And then we'll pass back after.
For me, the keyword would be the Gulf. I think that's sort of a black hole that, like the people have done so much wrong with they have wronged the globe, and globe is being personified here. The earth has been personified, that now she is so angry that she has come and she is slaughtering all the people who have wronged her. And it just, yeah, the Gulf, it seems to be like a black hole that people will be like engulfed in that because they have been doing so much, and now this step has to be, it has come into existence for the problem to be solved maybe.
That's great. Yeah, Gulf. I mean, connotations and denotations, right? Like at the literal level, the denotation is the Mississippi Gulf. That is like a location, right? A specific location. But your reading suggests we look at small g Gulf. It is typed small g Gulf. What do we think about a Gulf? Like that's like an opening, right? Like, so what does it mean to have swept into a Gulf and slaughtered? That could be any place where there is like an absence of care, maybe. That's great. Yes. Oh, okay. So there are two, and then make sure you pass behind you also. Okay.
Ma'am, I can only focus on the first part of the message. I think the glass and the metaphor of the glass and the stone, the glass represents the fragility of life during a disaster, and the stone represents the weight connected to that, the weight of the trauma which the survivors carry with them. And then we talk about hang the shards above my bed. Going to bed is a part of our daily life, and when we will hang those shards, whenever the author will go to bed, she will look at those shards and remember the trauma associated, the stories associated with it. And then they'll flash in the dark. Even when the whole world has moved on, Hurricane Katrina will become history one day. It has become history one day, but the trauma and the painful memories associated with them will persist for a long time.
That's so nice. Yes, I mean, glass and stone. Shards you connect with sharp glass, like brokenness, right? Like a weapon or a tool. But you have read this in a way that makes it a beautiful, like powerful reminder. Shards that flash in the dark. It's like, can you imagine it? Like a chandelier kind of thing, reflecting light above a teenage girl's bed. And it tells the story of it. That's what bears witness, bringing together the glass and the stone and the shards into a narrative. Like I would extend that and say, like, this is a metaphor for the process of writing itself, right? Like putting together these devastating details into a beautiful story that reflects light and remembers, tells the story. Otherwise, maybe it would be forgotten, right? Or told a different way, told in the way that says, you know, let New Orleans just fall into the water and we'll start over. Okay, yes, and then there is someone behind you. Yeah.
The whole passage talks about how she's turning to a myth in the face of a trauma.
Yes.
So when we talk about myth making, there is one reason that is referred very often, that like when humans were faced with unspeakable trauma of nature, like that they couldn't explain, like lightning, storms, and thunder and stuff like that, they turned it into myths and they called them gods.
Yes.
And here she's again faced with something that is so unexplainable and so hard to fathom. She's again turning into a myth to make sense of it.
Great.
And to make sense of that situation.
That's so smart. Yes. So that what are myths? They are exactly what you have said. A way of imagining an explanation for something we do not understand. And there's so much we do not understand, right? Like the natural world is a big part of that. And so here too, in a 21st century novel, we have a reference back to Greek myth as a way to help us understand something like a weather event. So the focus on myth is great.
I would like to connect this with my area of research, which is on the convicts and all. So here, normally women criminals are not, it is always associated with the socially constructed thing of women. If the recent cases, if we look, even in Kerala, I'm speaking about that. If a girl murders his boyfriend or something, the news gets very, very sensational, and even she gets the. Recently, we have a case, and she was given death penalty. So, but the same thing when it's done with the a boy, then the thing is not the. Sense it don't become that sensational and things. So the women criminality is something that it's very associated with the social. It's intersectional to be precise.
Yes.
So here, when it is talking about mother, the basic idea of mother and the social construct is that very lenient, very caring, very loving, and all those things. So just approaching it, I wouldn't go with the word oxymoron because it's socially constructed thing.
Great.
And yeah, so that is something which I kind of could connect to.
Thank you for that correction. And this is something I did not mention, but maybe it's interesting to your reading in terms of like the perspective of a young woman and how much weight she has on her. So we talked about the fact that she is pregnant throughout this whole novel. I think she's 14. And her question throughout is, does she keep this baby? Does she carry this pregnancy to term? And so that's the turning point. When she decides to make that decision to have the baby, we see her as coming into her own as a mother. But we do not blame her for wondering if she wants to carry the baby to term. She is a young girl, right? And so I love what you say about the social constructs of the nurturing, life-giving mother, because Ash herself is kind of thinking about herself possibly as a quote-unquote murderous mother, knowing that that's a patriarchal expectation that she keep her, that she nurture her pregnancy. Okay, so maybe we'll